This video is sponsored by Squarespace. More about them in just a moment. 750,000 subscribers. Thank you so much. This is so many more than I ever expected to have when I first started the channel. You've given me lots of questions to answer about a wide variety of topics, so let's plow right on. My name is Joe Foley, and this is unsolicited advice. Or in this case, I'm answering questions, so I suppose it is solicited, just this once. You said multiple times that you're an atheist. Late 19th and 20th century philosophers often warn against or tell us to cope with nihilism. Is nihil in nihilism the empty space God originally occupied? Have you yourself been a believer at some point? So, first of all, I have been a believer at some point. I find certain sects of Christianity really appealing, especially if they're pitched to me in the right way. I was raised in the Church of England, which, for those of you outside of England, is a very polite church. You know, it's a very nice place to be, the Church of England on the whole. So nice that some would say a criticism that's often levied at the Church of England from more traditional churches is that they're more concerned with being nice than being Christian, which might have something to it. At some point, there is a tendency for a lot of C of E services to just boil down to, right, and everyone, be nice to one another. And, I think there's value in that message, but I can also understand why a Christian of a more traditionalist bent might get a bit frustrated with that. But I quite like the C of E, and that was the church I was raised in. I don't have any particular scorn for religion or religious belief. I haven't had any bad experiences with religious belief or really religious people. Well, then I suppose I've technically had bad experiences with religious people, but no more so than I've had bad experiences with any other people. They're just sort of, the religion has been totally incidental to that. Yeah, I have been a believer at some point, and my journey to atheism was kind of reluctant. I would still consider myself a pretty reluctant atheist. I quite like the idea of God in a number of ways, which is why, despite being an atheist, so many of my videos on religion are attempting to play devil's advocate. Partly that's because I think that it is always a good idea to try and challenge your own views, and it's sometimes a lot more fun, and you get to argue against your own position. That's, in some ways, you have to be a lot more creative doing that than you do simply, bashing the same set of views that you hold. One of the nice things about the channel is I get to explore a whole bunch of different perspectives and attempt to argue for them on a whole range of topics. In terms of your nihilism thing, I would disagree that nihilism is a direct consequence of atheism, and I disagree for a number of reasons. One of them is that I have quite a multifaceted view of what nihilism is. I don't really consider nihilism to be one thing. I tend to consider nihilism to be something defined relative to a given pursuit or idea. So, I would call a moral nihilist somebody who either thinks that all moral facts are false or that all moral facts are irrelevant. They just don't find them motivating. And to that extent, I think atheism is a form of nihilism. I might call it theological nihilism, but I don't think that necessitates other forms of nihilism. Another type might be like, if you're an aesthetic nihilist, aesthetic nihilist, that might mean that you don't care about beauty. Even at the affective level, it simply doesn't resonate with you at all. And I have met people like that, who simply are not moved by aesthetics, though I'm pretty sure they're pretty few and far between in my experience, even though most people intellectually say, yeah, no, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And I would also concur with that. Though importantly, I don't think that means that you can find anything beautiful. I think that we quite often conflate subjectivity and variance, or variation. I've talked about that before. Most people think that there are no facts about what is beautiful, separate from reference to minds. That's one reason why I don't like to equate atheism and nihilism, because even if you're an atheist about God, you don't believe in God, you nonetheless can find lots of other things motivating and meaning-inducing. A great many atheists fall in love or enjoy great music or great poetry, or just, enjoy the pursuit of learning things. I think it's very rare for anyone to be a total nihilist about everything in practice. There have been a couple of big influences on the way that I think about nihilism. One of them is John Stewart's book, A History of Nihilism in the 19th Century, which the kind of model that he uses, actually, I don't know if this is exactly the model he uses. It might just be the thing that I've taken from his book. I don't know, maybe he wouldn't agree with me. But one of the themes that he touches upon in his History of Nihilism is this idea of nihilism as stemming from broken promises. So one of the things that makes a sudden transition to atheism potentially quite distressing and potentially nihilism-inducing is because you have been promised all of these things by your particular faith, and then you come to see them as false. And that can be really hurtful. That can genuinely be like a locus of meaning that has now been taken away from you. And I talked about romantic nihilism there through the lens of this broken promises model. I think that a lot of the reason why so many people are despairing about romance and about romantic love is because we have a whole series of narratives about romance such that, you're going to find someone who is just from the start perfectly compatible with you. Love is going to be easy. There is the one. All sorts of these kind of like rom-com narratives that we've inherited, which aren't necessarily a recent invention. They have a long and storied history, and you can check out Simon May's History of Love if you want to learn more about that, because that's a great book. One of the things that's occurred in the past 30, 20 years, gradually, is that not only have those myths and narratives been proven false, they've been proven false in a way that's really obvious to everyone. Like, nobody can stroll around today with an idea that they're going to find the one true person for them and be taken seriously, right? It's just not going to happen. However, we don't have alternative ideals yet. One of the ideals that I would suggest to kind of reframe many of our narratives around romance and love would be to think about romantic love more like how we think of a labor of love, something that requires kind of work and commitment and effort and is, to a certain extent, a matter of sticking through the points that are absurdly difficult in a kind of loose faith that there's something worthwhile on the other side. And I don't know if that would ever catch on, really. That would be one way I think about how people might want to solve issues of nihilism, is you have this ideal, this promise, it's been broken, you need a new promise that is more in line with the reality as you see it now. And this links quite closely with one of the other books that's really influenced my thinking on nihilism, which is Bernard Regenster's book on Nietzsche. It's called Nietzsche, An Affirmation of Life. And again, I highly recommend it. One of the things that he does in the first chapter of that book is he draws this distinction between nihilisms of despair and nihilisms of disorientation. So a nihilism of despair for Regenster's Nietzsche is when an ideal has been shown to be unattainable, but nonetheless it's still the ideal. So to take the romance example, that is, you know that the myth of the one is false, but nonetheless it remains the only thing that makes love worthwhile for you. And for God, it might be for that, you can no longer maintain your faith in God, but nonetheless, you still think that a life without God is not worth living. God is still the only thing that can justify your continued existence and existential fulfillment. That would be a nihilism of despair. A nihilism of disorientation, on the other hand, would be where you are lacking an ideal in some area, and as a result, you just don't quite know what to do. And I think that drawing out this distinction is actually very, very interesting. So I don't know how much that answers your question. I don't think that the nihil in nihilism is the empty space that God originally occupied as a kind of blanket statement, but I think it can be. But I do think that metaphor of nihilism as the empty space where something has been in the past and is no longer is still a really helpful way of thinking about nihilism. So I know, hope that answered your question. Moving on. But before moving on, I just want to take a quick moment to thank today's sponsor, Squarespace. If you're looking to build a website, then you know it can be a real hassle. First, you need to choose a domain name, and then you've got to design the whole thing, and there's always this underlying fear that you're messing things up and creating something that doesn't just look untidy, but actually looks unprofessional. But this is where Squarespace comes into play. They take all of that complexity and compress it down into a single platform, using ready-made templates to take all of the stress and headache out of website building. They also have a feature called Blueprint AI, which uses AI tools to help you make design choices, which is very handy if, like me, you're not necessarily that technologically gifted and don't have the mind of a graphic designer. Head to squarespace.com/unsolicited advice and use the code unsolicited advice to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain name. But anyway, back to the video. When can we expect OnlyFans? I'm terribly sorry to disappoint. I imagine not anytime soon. Perhaps if I'm in really, really dire financial straits. I promise you, I don't think that anyone really wants to see that. Maybe I'll set up OnlyFans and it's just sort of like book recommendations. I have a Patreon if you do want me to talk about random books. I'm doing a bookshelf tour at the moment, but I have yet to get my bits out on Patreon, and I suspect, barring some kind of extraordinary psychotic break, I will not be doing such things. But nonetheless, I appreciate the vote of confidence. I feel very buoyed up by the idea that there's someone out there that would appreciate my OnlyFans. This could very easily turn into a sort of like folk morality tale. Like be careful what you wish for. And you think that you want me to start an OnlyFans, but were you to ever get that, you would quickly realize that this was a cursed wish, a wish that should have never been made. You would be like Victor Frankenstein, sort of weeping over what you have done, unable to put this horrible development back in the bottle. So, for the good of all, and to not enact my own Shelleyan morality fable, I shall not be starting an OnlyFans. Joe, you are so profound in your philosophy. Oh, thank you very much. And you've helped me a lot. But now, let me fire away. Which video in your channel do you think is like your magnum opus? So, I have a sort of complicated relationship to almost every video on my channel, which is that after they're out there, I tend to just think of things that I could have improved or I could have done better. So, there aren't many things in my channel where I think, oh, that was perfect, and I really like that, and I wouldn't do anything to improve upon it. That's like a perfect, complete product, and I don't think that I'll ever have that with anything that I make. I just think that it's also I'd be quite disappointed if I step back after a video or after a Substack post or after a book, hopefully at some point, and thought, yeah, no, that's perfect, because I just think, God, right, it's just all downhill from here. Then that's actually quite depressing. Nonetheless, there are videos that I'm more proud of than others. I think my favorite video that I've ever made was actually my video on Dostoevsky's The Idiot. Partly that's because it's one of my favorite books. I think that it's just fantastic, and it also explores the idea of failed kindness that nonetheless is worth it, which I think is such a brilliant but underexplored theme in literature and storytelling. And so I really like that. I love talking about The Idiot. I think it's such a great book. And I also think that it doesn't get nearly as much press as Dostoevsky's other books. Lots of people have heard of Crime and Punishment or Notes from Underground or The Brothers Karamazov, but The Idiot flies under the radar. It's something of a controversial book amongst people who are into Dostoevsky. I've got one of my books on my bookshelf is by a guy called John Jones, and it's like a literary analysis of a whole series of Dostoevsky books from Poor Folk all the way up to The Brothers K. And he just hates The Idiot. He says, when he was reading The Idiot, he could not believe that it was the same genius that gave birth to Crime and Punishment or Demons or The Brothers Karamazov. And I disagree. I absolutely adore The Idiot. And as a result, I think that's probably the video that I might be most proud of, just because I like it when I get to talk about a book that people might not necessarily have on their radar, but nonetheless is brilliant, and I think deserves to be talked about a lot more than it is. All the videos are very fun to make, but I also do tend to, after about a month, maybe 2 months, look back on them and think, oh, I wouldn't have said that, I wouldn't have said this, I would have put this differently. Maybe I've read something in the meantime that I think, oh God, I'm just not quite happy with that. But that's good. I like to think that means that I'm learning more. Though, I don't know, maybe that's just cope. What is your retort to the idea that philosophy is a useless or impractical subject to study? So, I think the first thing is that one has to concede some ground here. Philosophy is not going to be as practically, it's not going to keep bridges up in the same way that engineering is, right? One thing is that philosophy actually is very practical a lot of the time to your everyday life, right? I think that, engineering, I'm friends with a lot of very, very talented engineers, and what they do is incredibly clever, and often highly sophisticated and mathematically brilliant. There's a lot of everyday life that implicitly is tapping into philosophical ideas, sort of whether we like it or not. You have to, in your everyday life, make value judgments. You have to prioritize your actions and attention. You have to consciously, well, you don't have to consciously shape what you think is valuable and worthwhile, but if you don't think about what you think is valuable and worthwhile, you're going to have ideas of what's valuable and worthwhile anyway. They're just not going to be ideas that you've reflected upon and had the opportunity to refine and choose. And I would suggest that those refined, consciously chosen ideas might be more conducive to your own happiness in the long term. I mean, I suppose part of this, or part of the perception that philosophy is a useless or impractical subject, I think comes from the fact that philosophy is just incredibly broad. And any field that's incredibly broad is going to incorporate useless or impractical elements to it. It's not that it's all useless or impractical. It's just that parts of it are useless and impractical. I mean, I'm pretty generally anti-metaphysics. Maybe that's just because it doesn't take my fancy. It's not that I think that people who work in metaphysics are like silly or anything like that. I think that some of the cleverest work in philosophy is done in metaphysics, just in terms of like the sheer brain power you have to understand some of it, let alone write it. But at the same time, it does often get very divorced from reality. But I think things like epistemology, the study of knowledge, or philosophy of language, the study of how language works, and moreover, how to use language, something like ethics, what is the good life and how do we achieve it? Or existential philosophy, what are the kind of things that are going to make an existentially fulfilling life? These are really practical problems. And it's not just practical in the sense that if as a society we could come up with a really sophisticated and helpful idea of what the good life looks like, that would obviously be really helpful, and would presumably have all kinds of very, very cool productive political implications as well. The good life is a question that you're confronting literally every single day. I'd also say that, fields like epistemology are incredibly handy. They are the backbone of all sorts of things that we do, so much so that we don't even notice it. It's almost like the water we're swimming in when we conduct things like scientific inquiry or just everyday inquiry. We are assuming a kind of epistemology here. And if we assume a flawed one, that's not great. That has real practical consequences in the real world. Things like the philosophy of science and how to distinguish and identify pseudoscience or just poor epistemology in general. These are fields with immense practical import in kind of very obvious ways. And this is not to talk about fields like the philosophy of mind. An awful lot of the philosophy of mind is done in conjunction with the work of neuroscientists. And often you will find philosophers co-authoring philosophy of mind papers with neuroscientists and psychologists. And I think that philosophy, in that sense, kind of the academic side of philosophy that's trying to get us to new information about the world, as philosophy of mind is, right? It's trying to discover profound and philosophical truths about the mind. Is the mind physical or non-physical? What type of thing is the mind? How should we best conceive of the mind? Should we conceive of the mind as software? Is that a good metaphor? Should we conceive of the mind as a collection of dispositions? Should we try and stick to behavior as much as possible? Or should we, really look for representational models that help us predict human behavior and can kind of, does it matter whether those map on directly onto neurological states, or will we just study these things separately and then create bridging laws between the two? These are really practical questions. They are also questions that I think that philosophers obviously can't answer by themselves, but by and large, they don't try to answer them by themselves. They often are writing these papers in conjunction with people with a lot of empirical study of the mind as well. And speaking to neuroscientists that I know and philosophers of mind that I have met and know, a lot of them do take an awful lot from this collaborative process. A lot of the neuroscientists I've spoken have actually talked quite highly about how helpful it is to have a kind of almost pedantic, analytic, philosophical approach on a research team. And likewise, philosophers of mind are often very open about how much they get from having this sound empirical base underlying their research. So my retort to the idea that philosophy is useless or impractical is one that philosophy is almost unavoidable. The people have been talking about philosophy being dead for hundreds and hundreds of years, and philosophy will die when people stop asking philosophical questions, and they just haven't. I don't think they will. Secondly, it's that some philosophy seems like it's useless or impractical simply because it is, one of the areas of philosophy that is useless and impractical. But just as there is bad science, or there can be like science that isn't immediately practical, there is also philosophy that is not immediately practical. And there's also bad philosophy. Like anything, bad philosophy can give the field a bad name, but that doesn't negate all of the good philosophy that happens as well. And thirdly, I would say that this image of the philosopher as somebody on their armchair trying to figure out the nature of the universe without investigating it was basically never true, but it's especially not true now. That's simply not how philosophers tend to do things, especially with something like the philosophy of mind, or like epistemology with regard to belief formation, or moral psychology. These are practical experimental fields, or at least fields with practical experimental aspects that are paid an awful lot of heed to. when philosophers are conducting their inquiry there, because a lot of the philosophy is useless takes come from this much older caricature, I would say, of what a philosopher does that, again, wasn't true then and definitely isn't true now. I am a firm believer in keeping philosophy practical, though. I have been really influenced by thinkers like William James and C.S. Peirce and Hugh Price and Hasok Chang most recently, all of whom are in some way or another in the pragmatist tradition of philosophy. Slightly different vein of the pragmatist tradition from people like Richard Rorty, but nonetheless, highly pragmatic philosophers. And so I don't know, that kind of underlying spirit hums in the background of my own philosophical thinking. If presented with a philosophical problem, I will quite often attempt to immediately try to tease out what the practical and pragmatic consequences of different answers to that problem are. And if there are none, I just tend to lose interest. But I also do think that how we conceive of the world, even at a sort of metaphysical level, despite my slight distaste for metaphysics, how we conceive of the world in that way probably does have a bearing on how we approach it. I imagine that it would be difficult to work out the exact details of the causal chains there, but nonetheless, there almost certainly is some influence there. So, I don't know, a vote back in favour of metaphysics, I suppose, to end my answer to this question. But yeah, broadly, I don't think that philosophy is useless or impractical, but it doesn't build bridges either. Have you ever thought about creating a social media account on another platform? And congratulations. Oh, thank you very much. And I have. I used to have a TikTok. I haven't updated it in months and months and months, just because I really don't like making short form content. I should do, because it's really good for, views and engagement and stuff. But I just can't do it. I find it soul crushing in a lot of ways. What I should do is like cut things from my longer content. But the trouble is, I'm such an over verbose rambling bastard that I very rarely have like a minute of footage that lends itself very well to being cut and put on a TikTok or put on a YouTube short. But I should get an Instagram. I feel it's the kind of thing that, you just kind of do. Like I only have YouTube as my active platform. I technically have a Twitter account, but I do not use it. But I would like to start Instagram. Partly because I go on a lot of walks, and I don't know, I could post little flowers. In spring, where I live, the bluebells come out at around late February, early March time, and they look absolutely beautiful. So maybe I'll start an Instagram there, and I'll put lots of pictures of bluebells up there. 3 favourite philosophers. Picking just 3 is so hard. That's a very tough question. Frank Ramsey might be one of them. And I don't know, maybe. Thing is, I really like Frank Ramsey, but also don't draw on his philosophy as much as many others. I think he's just an absolute genius. And whenever I read one of his papers, I'm just in absolute awe. And he also died tragically young. Someone once compared Frank Ramsey's early death to if Isaac Newton had died before publishing the Principia. And I think that's probably a fair assessment. Ramsey was just an absolute genius. But I don't know if he would be one of my 3 favourites. I do love Frank Ramsey. C.S. Peirce, I think, would definitely be on there. He's a legend, and so underappreciated. Probably more appreciated now. There have been some real Peirce heads in recent years. Cheryl Mizak's a real Peirce head, and she's an absolute giant. And she's written a lot on C.S. Peirce, and so I think that he's got a bit more limelight recently. But he's an American pragmatist philosopher, and I think does all of the things that William James does, but just like slightly better. And also, he came up with a logic system as well, sort of parallel to the time that Frege was writing his logic system. But Peirce's logic system was pictorial, which is just really interesting. It's not very practical to use, but it is fun. It's interesting to see a spatial logic system, because on the face of it, we use Venn diagrams when we teach logic and set theory and stuff. So I don't know why we wouldn't, why this has never been a further avenue of inquiry, seeing if we could create very, very detailed pictures of logical stuff. I suppose Gentzen trees are a bit like that. But I'm not going to go on about Gentzen trees now. That'll be, you will all fall asleep. But they're a very cool style of proof system. So C.S. Peirce would probably be one. Other favourite philosophers. I quite like Nietzsche. Maybe that would be one of my favourite philosophers, but kind of with the caveat that I'm not 100% sure what Nietzsche said. It's like, I spend a lot of time reading Nietzsche, and I spend a lot of time reading secondary literature around Nietzsche. And it seems like the more I learn, the less I know. You know what I mean? It's like every time I settle in an interpretation of one of Nietzsche's core concepts, I will come across a paragraph or a paper or something that just calls it into question. But I do nonetheless really love his work in a lot of ways. I think his picture of psychology is amazing, and resonates very much with me. I'm a big fan of decompositional views of the self and of the mind, so that really appeals to me. His kind of conception of the human psyche as like a mass of writhing drives. I mean, it's just awesome, man. But so maybe Nietzsche with the caveat that the value that you get in with wrestling with Nietzsche over time, that makes him worthwhile. Third one might have to be Frege. I love Frege. Again, really kind of logical background in logic showing a bit there. But, you can't get better than the Begriffsschrift. It's just one of the greatest books in history. And then honorable mention, I suppose, would be someone like Dostoevsky, because I don't know if he would consider himself a philosopher. He's had such an impact on my life, especially something like the Brothers Karamazov. I've got the Brothers Karamazov on my desk here. And I told this story in Alex's podcast, but I am quite prone to sort of panic. God, this is like the fourth time I think I've reread it in the past year and a half. But this is basically because I'm quite prone to getting quite anxious when things change very quickly. And so whenever I'm in a period of my life where things are changing quite quickly, I'll often go back and read the Brothers Karamazov, and it always calms me down. There was a point just over a year ago now where I was moving flat. The channel was doing really well, but I was getting used to the idea of people watching what I said, and this amount of change just completely threw me for six, I think is the expression. One of the only ways that I could calm myself down once I worked myself up about this was that I would sit down and I'd read a chapter of the Brothers Karamazov, and everything would just feel better. And I don't know why. It's not even, I wouldn't even necessarily read a chapter that was particularly calming in content, but it would just soothe me. So that would be my honorable mention. I don't know if Dostoevsky would call himself a philosopher. He would have to be up there in some sense. And of course, we're just talking about the stretching it from my favorite philosophers to great philosophers, obviously. Aristotle. Everything about Aristotle is brilliant. Even when Aristotle is wrong, he's wrong in brilliant ways, because, we've got over 2,000 years of empirical science on Aristotle, but even given that, reading Aristotle is like, you just feel the genius simmering off the page, and it's amazing. Aristotle is always someone that despite the fact he can be quite hard to read, because what we have, I think, are largely thought to be his lecture notes and stuff like that. He is fantastic. There's nothing quite like reading Aristotle. So I've kind of cheated there because I picked 5 rather than 3, which is typical of me, really. But yes, that I think would be some of my favorites. To what extent do you think the time period a philosopher lived in can excuse the harmful ideas they espouse? For example, I love some of Schopenhauer's work, but his rejection of intellectual women leaves me respecting his thoughts less. I think this is a really interesting question. It doesn't even have to be with regards to historical time period, and it doesn't even necessarily have to be with regards to something that you find distasteful. It can also just be something that you disagree with. I really like the work of C.S. Lewis, but he's a theist, and I'm not. I really like the work of Dostoevsky, but he is a theist, and I am not. So what do I do with that? How do I separate such core conceptions of their thought that I, strictly speaking, think are not true, and nonetheless, both, make sure that when I am reading them and I'm just trying to get what resonates with me out of them, or just trying to get, the wisdom that I think is really valuable and I think is true out of those texts. How do I end up not just blatantly misrepresenting them by inadvertently de-godifying them? But also, what impact does this have on their other thoughts? Schopenhauer's a really interesting one. I suppose Schopenhauer on women is, to a certain extent, something that you can it is peripheral to his philosophy, in a similar way that a lot of the kind of distasteful things that Nietzsche said about women is often peripheral to his philosophy. So with Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, it might be slightly easier. I mean, I would say that something like Aristotle's belief that there are some people who are kind of naturally slave-like is much more difficult to detach from some of his ideas about virtue, because arguably that discolors it in a way that it's not peripheral. That is, his idea of virtue is incredibly contingent on his idea of the human, and his idea of the human is run through with a kind of loose anti-egalitarianism that is, perfectly common for that, sect of Greek society. We forget how new the mere concept of egalitarianism is. There are some ancient Greek schools that were egalitarian, Cynics, Stoics, at least some Stoics, but yeah, Aristotle wasn't. So I know it's something that you wrestle with, right? Because on one level you can say, oh, don't worry about it because technically, logically speaking, you can carve these off of their philosophies. But at the same time, when you're reading them, you don't want to shy away from the parts that you find uncomfortable because that feels a bit strange, right? When I'm reading a theistic philosopher, I don't just want to treat them, I just want to strip that from their philosophy because then in a certain sense, I'm making it less challenging for myself. Is there something about sitting there wrestling with the tensions, which I think is probably less of a big deal with someone like Schopenhauer and Nietzsche regarding their kind of sexism, because it is often peripheral to their general philosophical views. But something like Nietzsche's anti-egalitarianism, right, is another example. Nietzsche's anti-democratic ideals. That's something that you cannot run from, really. I mean, you can try and interpret your way out of them and interpret these as metaphors and stuff like that. And maybe that works. I can't quite do that, at least not at present. So, but that is part of what makes Nietzsche so challenging to read at an emotional level, let alone at a kind of cognitive level. When you say, to what extent do you think the time period a philosopher lived in can excuse the harmful ideas they espouse? I suppose that's not something I think about that much because I'm not that interested in whether the philosophers I read are like ethical ideals. But it is that idea of how do I balance the things that a philosopher says that I really, vehemently disagree with or might vehemently disagree with also not caricaturing them, but nor shying away from those aspects. And also trying to get the most wisdom out of them, which is a kind of individuating process, right? Because the wisdom that I get out of someone like Dostoevsky is going to be very different from the wisdom that someone who is a hardcore Orthodox Christian gets out of Dostoevsky. And there's inevitably a kind of subjectifying element to that process because you are going out of your way to make a thinker relevant to you. And I think that's really important, when we're reading philosophy. We don't just, I'm not just interested in what Aristotle said as a matter of academic exercise. I want to know how this can become lived, experienced wisdom. I suppose it depends. On the one hand, when you're representing those views, like when you're talking in the voice of that philosopher, I think it's important to try not to shy away from them as much as possible. When you're, stripping their ideas for parts almost, when you're trying to take what is useful and attempting to leave the rest, or take what you perceive to be true and leave the rest, I think that there you can, start separating things off. In terms of excusing them, I mean, it depends, right? Like, I mean, I don't tend to do much moral judgment myself, and I've explained why that is in a blog post about why I think that for me to do stuff like that would make me a big moral hypocrite. So I know that's not something I think too much about, but I do think that this raises a fun and interesting interpretive challenge when we're approaching these texts. What's your favorite scene/moment in all of literature? So there are a couple of really good contenders here. One is when Ivan Karamazov finishes telling the story of the Grand Inquisitor and Alyosha kisses him on the cheek in response. And that's amazing. Anything that Alyosha does in The Brothers Karamazov is amazing. And that's a moment that really stands out to me. That, or the moment where he helps Grushenka see that she is not beyond redemption. I just absolutely adore that. In terms of, there are a few moments from Stendhal's The Red and the Black that I think are like very thrilling. The Red and the Black revolves around a lot of like amorous trysts and affairs and stuff like that. And there are moments where Stendhal is really good at getting across the thrill and emotional excitement of the characters and the risk they're taking, and the kind of romantic push and pull between our lead, Julien Sorel, and Madame Renal is just, it's just, I've never seen anyone write quite like it. It's thick and electric. And yeah, that leads to some absolutely fantastic moments. Like when they're kind of, there's one moment where having a big dispute, and then it kind of resolves in this big amorous embrace, and that's a fantastic scene. But I don't want to spoil that too much. There are some great scenes from Madame Bovary. The scene in the carriage is obviously the famous one that I think is very good. Also, the murder scene in Crime and Punishment, and actually the interrogation scene in Crime and Punishment, where Raskolnikov is being interrogated by Porfiry Petrovich. It's just like this kind of witty back and forth, and that's, again, very thrilling. I think that Crime and Punishment is by far Dostoevsky's most thrilling book. There are almost too many to count. There are also just loads of ones that aren't necessarily from dramatic literature that I really love. There's an argument in Right Ho Jeeves, which is a silly English comedy by P.G. Wodehouse, where Jeeves and Bertie Wooster are arguing over a mess jacket that Jeeves, the butler, thinks is deeply unfashionable, and Bertie Wooster is determined on wearing. And it's just very funny. All of the scenes from Yes Minister are also hilarious. So I don't know how helpful that was. That was a whole bunch of different ones, and I couldn't possibly pick a favorite because I'm terribly indecisive. What's your favorite type of cheese? My favorite type of cheese is Black Sticks Blue. I'm going to check where Black Sticks Blue is from, because it's brilliant. It's like the nicest cheese I've ever tasted. It's apparently, it says, according to Butler's Farmhouse Cheeses, it's the UK's favourite cheese. That's amazing. Where does it come from? Lancashire. So I don't know if you can get your hands on this outside the UK. Please do. It's absolutely amazing. It's like a kind of creamy, very strong blue cheese. Fantastic stuff. Great with red onion chutney. I hope that's helpful. If you're in the UK, please do get your hands on some Black Sticks Blue. And if you're out of the UK, please also do, but it might be more expensive, or maybe they do make it in other parts of the world. Do you use digital app stroke website like Notion stroke Obsidian for your note-taking at books, or do you prefer real paper notebooks? So I used to use Notion, and before that, I had no note organizing system, which wasn't great because I kept making mistakes because I would put a note sheet in the wrong folder, and I would end up talking about a point as if it was in one book when actually it was in another, because I write my notes over quite a long period of time, and each video takes quite a long time to make. I like to let videos stew for a long time before I end up actually writing the script and filming them. So that was a disaster. Then I used Notion for a long time, but no, I didn't the thing that I didn't massively like about Notion, or about typed notes more generally, I still do type notes a fair amount of the time if I just need to record a lot of information quickly, because obviously typing is much quicker than writing. But the thing that I didn't like about it is that you almost just get too used to referring back to your Notion notepad and stuff. It means that you don't have to hold things in your head as much. And I'm a really big fan of memory and holding things in the little grey cells. And so now I do probably most of my note taking by hand, or I've got a Kindle Scribe, so I kind of scribble on the outside of things. I also write lots of notes in books I'm reading, which is actually, and part of this is quite exciting. I couldn't really handwrite for a number of years because I had loads of damage in my arm from falling off my bike when I was very little, and then it just kind of aggravated it over and over again. And then I kind of did lots of physiotherapy, and now I can handwrite again pretty well. So I find that quite exciting and new. I say new, I've been able to do it for years now, but it's it's still kind of thrilling because I couldn't do that for 4 years, not properly at least. It would take forever, and I just couldn't do it. So yeah, so now a lot of my notes are handwritten. I have a notebook that contains all of them. And that's lots of fun. This is by far my favorite, and also it definitely helps the information stick in my head for longer. What do you think about the philosophical postulates of Buddhism, such as the epistemology or the relationship between linguistics and reality formulated by the Buddha? I know a little bit about Buddhism. I've read a fair amount of the primary literature, in the kind of third basket of the Tripitaka, but I'm not as au fait with commentaries on it and stuff. The thing that I always like, and I think is really caricatured about Buddhism in the West, is that a lot of the philosophical dialogues in that early, kind of very early schools of Buddhism, they are incredibly analytic. The Buddha is in some ways, sometimes you're reading these dialogues and you're like, oh my God, Siddhartha Gautama, you are the hardcore empiricist philosopher that I've been dreaming of. This is the David Hume of ancient India. And one really good example of that is where the Buddha kind of deconstructs the notion of the self by asking, is there anything permanent in your senses? Is there anything permanent in your behavioral properties? Is there anything permanent in your disposition? Just goes through a whole list of purported fixed points for the mind and just says, no, that one changes, no, that one changes, no, that one changes. And I think, God, this is David Hume's argument for the bundle theory of the self. 2,500 years before David Hume was ever born, ever graced our wonderful Scottish lands. So, I think that one of the things that I would like to make a video on at some point, and I'm just figuring out the right framing and the right way to do it, is I want to make a video on this really analytic style of Buddhist argumentation and how a lot of the time Buddhist philosophy is kind of caricatured, I find, in the West as this kind of wooey, feelings-based philosophy when, like any kind of religion or philosophical school, it has, mystical traditions, and there are elements of that, especially in things like Zen Buddhism, which I think are kind of valuable in their own right. I don't mean that to bash Zen Buddhism. But we ought not to pretend that there wasn't hardcore analytic style thought in Buddhism. So that's kind of my broad view on things. I'd like to do a video on this, on just that really, and maybe just covering a few of the suttas or sutras that demonstrate this, hard-nosed is probably the best word for it, aspect of Buddhist philosophy. Is there a philosopher/philosophy you've been wanting to get into further but haven't been able to yet? So, well, that's one example. Another is someone like Hegel. I've tried reading Hegel, and I have not understood Hegel at all. I've kind of, dipped around the secondary literature trying just to get an idea of what he's about. That whole kind of Hegel and post-Hegelian vein of philosophy just isn't taught that much in the UK. So I'm kind of really playing catch up there. One of the reasons why you'll notice I don't talk about Hegel or Fichte on the channel is that I don't know them nearly confidently enough to talk about. I would like to at some point, but it's just playing catch up. In the same way that I can riff on Frege pretty easily, but like that's not necessarily a thinker that is studied that in that much detail at a lot of more continental focused philosophical institutions. It's just a blind spot. And I kind of work to remedy these blind spots over time, but it's a long and slow process, because not only do I have to become familiar with the philosopher, I have to become familiar enough that I am confident enough talking about it on the channel, which is generally a much higher bar to cross over. Also, like things like the French postmodernists, I have read some of them, but I really do need to get more familiar with them. Like I tell you, a good example of this is like Deleuze and Guattari, right? I would love to get more familiar with them, but like approaching them without a kind of proper preparation is nearly impossible. I've cracked open Anti-Oedipus, and it's like it may as well not have been translated from French. For all that I can understand it. That's another example of where I just need to go back to the drawing board. I need to do loads and loads of prior research, and then maybe I'll be able to understand some of these texts. I mean, there are French postmodern or postmodernish philosophers that I do really enjoy. Foucault is actually a good example. Foucault actually gets a bad rap for writing unclearly. I think he could be clearer at times, but Foucault is, in my experience, not nearly as difficult as someone like Deleuze or Derrida. But nonetheless, I'd like to dig into some of these figures. Like anything, it takes time. I'm only 25. I've got so much more to read and so much more to learn, and it's very exciting. But yeah, those are the kind of philosophers that I would love to get further into. But I just haven't had the chance yet. Oh, and also Pascal. Yeah, I'd love to read more Blaise Pascal, and I'd like to get more familiar with Spinoza. Those are both thinkers that I have read. And like I think I've done at least one thorough read through of like the Pensée and Spinoza's Ethics, but wouldn't feel confident talking about them on the channel without going back to the drawing board and checking out some kind of secondary literature to just check that I haven't like completely screwed it up. It's always a good idea to do one lap of the basic secondary literature before, just to check that you haven't fallen into like a really obvious misinterpretation, because it's very easy to. You once said that your views are always evolving and seems to be pretty comfortable about it. However, doesn't that make your current views a bit shaky? I mean, how do you know that what you, or any other person for that matter, hold to be truth right now is truth? How do you reconcile this notion that I may be correct in the moment, but I might adopt a different position in the future? Doesn't that make you doubt your current views and make it inevitable that you will change them in future because you always looked at them with an eye of suspicion, I suppose it is, in the moment? Absolutely. Yeah, I hold my views as experiments in a lot of ways. I talked about this in the last video. Walter Kaufmann, in his interpretation of Nietzsche, really highlights the idea of there being kind of a kind of experimental attitude in his philosophy, both in being willing to play with a whole bunch of different ideas and change over time, and also in living out these ideas and seeing how they function out there in the world when you are inhabiting them. And yeah, I do that. I think of my philosophy and philosophical views as an evolving process. And to be honest, that's a lot more fun because it means that I have already accepted going into things that I'm likely to have to evolve my view over time. Hopefully, as much as anyone can, my fingers crossed, is that this will help not let my sinful human pride take over and entrap my ego in my current views, which I think is often an impediment to learning. What's your reading speed? Got to be ludicrously fast for how quickly you get long-form videos out consistently. My reading speed, I do read pretty quickly, but philosophy is just slower than reading most things. It's not that necessarily I read ludicrously fast, it's just that this is my full-time job, so I probably read like 5 or 6 hours a day. It's just a long time spent reading. You don't have to be that quick in order to get through a lot of reading in that time. The other thing is that I balance, with long-form videos, I balance out ones that I need to prepare quite a lot for, and ones that are either working off prior knowledge, just things that I already know, or are kind of casual videos and are just, us sitting down and having a chat. Because I like to keep those kind of fresh and spontaneous, and so I don't do much preparation. Like this, I haven't done much preparation. Well, I haven't really done any preparation for this because I want it to be natural. I don't want to unconsciously put an artifice on it. So I wouldn't say that my reading speed is enormous. I probably read quicker than the average person. Partly that's just I spend so much time reading. But most of the reason why I get a lot of reading done is because, I probably work 60 to 70 hours a week on the channel, and most of that time is spent reading or planning. I've got a lovely editor who takes care of all of the editing side of things for me, and I'm also currently in talks to get someone on board to do my thumbnails. So I eventually want it to be that it's just me doing the reading and writing and recording, and then everything else is taken care of. That would be lovely, but that's a bit of a pipe dream. What's the most overrated debate in your opinion? I think it's probably free will. I just don't think much hangs on it. I think that quite a lot of the time when somebody is talking about the significance of libertarian free will, like libertarian free will is this idea of free will as an uncaused cause. I think that quite a lot of the time when people are getting het up about that, they are often implicitly concerned about ownership of will and ownership of action. So one example that might help to illustrate this point is that under a libertarian free will universe, a kind of theoretical libertarian free will universe where nobody's causes are determined, you can still have things like coercion, and you can still have things like somebody being threatened to do something, and you can still have people having psychotic breaks where their actions don't seem like their own. And I think that quite a lot of our moral machinery around free will is actually done by this idea of ownership or kind of autonomy rather than freedom. I think that a lot of the debate around free will is just a bit of a red herring. We think about ownness of actions as a sort of whether something fits into a model of that person's psyche that can predict further behavior. And I think that's often the important thing we're trying to track with our moral notions around free will and choice and decisions. Like, what does it say about them? What something says about them, it doesn't matter whether they were, whether that person is an uncaused cause or whether they're a predetermined agent. You're still describing an object and a subject out in the world. So I think that the free will debate, especially in popular discourse, is often quite confused. I think that it does often run together different notions, and as a result makes itself less interesting. I think this debate around when someone owns their actions is fascinating and ethically impactful and just psychologically interesting, right? So there's that story about a man who got very aggressive very suddenly and was like hitting people. And then they found out that that was due to a tumor, and they got the tumor removed, and then he was fine. And intuitively want to say, well, that person shouldn't be punished for the actions of their tumor self. And I would suggest that this is partly, the tumor is no less of a physical cause than just their untumored brain. But nonetheless, that removal of the tumor creates a pragmatic discontinuity between him with the tumor and him without the tumor. The kind of practical function of our notions of autonomy of action and moral responsibility are partly to model and manage people's behavior. And there being such a stark discontinuity, even though it is the same person, and if you're not a dualist, it's not like there was some kind of non-physical force before controlling him. Nonetheless, the discontinuity means that this pragmatic ascription of model behavior no longer makes a lot of sense, and so our moral notions break down. That would be my argument. But that's that you can so see my kind of pragmatist background there, because that's such a classically pragmatist story. So, I don't know. Let me know what you think about this one, actually. What do you think is the most overrated debate? Some people say God. I actually think God is not an overrated debate. But then again, I just find it really interesting. So maybe that's why I don't think it's overrated. But anyway, on to the next one. What is your hot take? I suppose there could be a number of things that would be my hot take. I think that my spiciest philosophical opinion is that I think that the kind of pragmatist program that kind of originated in James and Pearce and has been further developed by people like Hugh Price and Ha-Seok Chang is, in my opinion, the most fruitful avenue for the future of philosophy and how to view philosophy and how to manage philosophical inquiry and how to approach different questions. But then again, I would say that, and that is a highly controversial opinion. Even 30 years after, Price's Facts and the Function of Truth was first published, this is still an incredibly minority opinion in philosophy. Nonetheless, I'll go to bat for it. I might make a video at some point explaining why it is that I think this. One of my main reasons is that Price originates a philosophical program called subject naturalism. And subject naturalism takes the naturalistic assumptions that underlie scientific inquiry and wants to tease out their philosophical implications for the human as a naturalistic subject. So one of the reasons I think this is important is because on the face of it, there are a lot of underlying assumptions in philosophical practice or mainstream philosophical practice that seem to me to be quite anti-naturalistic and mysterious. Things like the correspondence relation between words and the world, a sort of a thick idea of metaphysical truth that I think can sometimes be a little bit anti-naturalistic. And if you're a non-naturalistic philosopher, that's absolutely fine. I think this is absolutely the right program, for example, for a scholastic style philosophy. I don't think there's any issue with scholastic philosophers helping themselves to these heavyweight metaphysical notions. But I do think that naturalistic philosophers should probably think twice about it, because on the face of it, these are quite non-naturalistic ideas. And, how would we have a naturalistic grounding for the kind of mirror of nature picture of the human mind and human language? I'm not sure that we could. So I really like the idea of subject naturalism as a way of framing philosophy in that kind of comes out of pragmatism. And also, I've become very enamored with the vision of philosophy of science that Ha-Seok Chang puts forward in Realism for Realistic People, which is broadly pragmatist. I don't know, pragmatism really excites me as a philosophical program in a way that not many other things do. I also think that this ties back to a question asked earlier about how would I respond to somebody saying that philosophy is useless or pointless, is that I do think that philosophy needs to come up with some kind of way of trimming fat and not wasting loads of time on questions that are just totally intractable or are not amenable to rational inquiry. And there have been various ways that people have tried to do this. Hume was very skeptical of metaphysics, as were the 20th century kind of logical positivists, and then the outgrowth of logical positivism, people like kind of later Carnap and stuff like that. And while I think those programs did fail, I think that we still do need something to be the motivating impetus behind our philosophical practice. And pragmatism's focus on doing and operations and knowledge how and activity really appeals to me. That's probably my hottest philosophical take. Hot in academic circles, at least, or that would be a very controversial thing for me to say. In fact, I spent quite a lot of time in my third year of my master's year arguing with other people about this and attempting to give the case for this. There was a small group of graduate students and professors who were really into pragmatism at Cambridge, but we were still very much in the minority, and I assume still are. But I get very excited. It's very dry, kind of very dry, hardcore modern analytic philosophy. But I really, really like it, and I think it could provide this fat trimming mechanism if we kind of lean into it and refine it. And also, we might discover that it can allow us to pursue new philosophical avenues. Like one of the implications of Hugh Price's style of pragmatism is you end up with a kind of metaphysical pluralism because you're not necessarily taking metaphysics as seriously as you were before. And I think that's really interesting. I'd really like to explore that. And I think there are good reasons to do so. It's very later Wittgenstein, and there's a lot to be said for later Wittgenstein. What is your experience of having friendships with religious people as an agnostic? Do you find having differing worldviews causes tension or distance in a friendship or not? What kind of things do you find help maintain friendships across beliefs? Yeah, I've got plenty of religious friends. Some of my closest friends are religious. It just doesn't get in the way. I mean, we have discussions about religion and we try and see one another's point of view. I think it's really important to have friends that you vehemently disagree with on pretty major things, because otherwise I think it's very easy to lose touch with the reasons behind why people believe what they believe. In my opinion, I think the biggest facilitator of straw manning is just absence. If I didn't speak to a religious person for 5 years, I'm sure that I would end up with a completely caricatured idea of both what they believed and why they believed what they believed. So that's why I think having friendships with people with opposing philosophical views or just philosophical disagreements with you is incredibly important. I think it's absolutely vital. I can't imagine anything more stultifying than only talking to people that I agree with, even on quite foundational points. The one thing I would say, one of the things that atheists and agnostics tend to complain about with regard to religious people or having religious friends is that they'll try to evangelize them. And I'm totally the opposite. I'm always very offended when I have a friend who's devoutly religious and they're like, don't even try to convert me. I'm just like, bro, do you think that I deserve hell? You think that I'm going to inherit eternal damnation if you don't convert me, and yet you haven't even tried? I find that grossly offensive. Luckily, all of my religious friends have at some point tried to evangelize or convert me. And so I'm convinced that they care deeply about my immortal soul. I think the same thing about people that knock on your door, like the Mormons or the Jehovah's Witnesses, and kind of try and tell you God. I don't know. Again, people say they're annoying, and I guess that probably is true, right? If they catch you at a bad moment. But at the same time, I can't help but think, oh, this is really nice. This person's sort of taken time out of their afternoon to try and, in their view, save my soul. And although I obviously disagree that my soul is damned in that way, it's just nice. I like that. I think that, that's kind of a lovely thing to do. If I was religious, I think I'd spend an awful lot of time evangelizing, because otherwise I just feel like, oh yeah, all the people that I care about who don't believe, once we die, we're going to be eternally separated and they're going to be tormented forever. That sounds horrible. So I know I'd be deeply suspicious of religious friends that refuse to even try to convert me. But as I say, all my religious friends do, so I'm sure they're fond of me. Why is the lamp in front of the door? The lamp, I get so many comments about this. The lamp is in front of the door basically because it balances out the frame, right? So normally when I'm not recording, the lamp is sort of against that wall. It's just behind where my head is. If the lamp stays there while I'm filming, it kind of gives me like a weird halo effect, and it just all looks a bit strange. And also then that side of the frame just looks empty and barren and sad. Look, I'll tell you, I will show you what I mean. So when I'm not filming, the lamp's there. And as you can see, the frame now looks very odd, and I also have sort of a slightly weird, deeply unearned saintly glow. And whereas before, when it's in the frame just looks a lot better. It looks a lot more balanced. That's why I have the lamp in front of the door. It's not like a kind of interior design choice. I'm not that odd. But that's why the lamp's in front of the door. It's because it just has a nice lighting effect. It's nice to have a kind of blurry light in the background. I always just think it kind of adds a bit of depth to the frame. I like these videos to look nice, It's not. I don't spend an awful lot of time on my aesthetics for the videos, because I'm just not that aesthetically minded in that way. And like I don't want to, I don't want every video to be like loads of sets and costumes, because there are plenty of people that do that, and I think that's really cool, but it's just not really in my skill set. But the lamp, I think, does help with a kind of shot composition. And of course, I can still leave my room. I just have to move the lamp before I do so. What is your favorite music? As a philosopher, do you focus on lyrics a lot? So, I mean, I'm not going to be defeating the sort of pretentious wanker allegations with this, but I really like opera, and I specifically like a silly kind of English opera or operetta called QnS. These are by the composer Gilbert and the librettist Sullivan, and they're just very funny. They're like the Jeeves and Wooster books, but in musical form, effectively. And I know I really like a lot of silly music. I listen to a lot of musical comedians. And I know I like music as a kind of source of lightness. And I also quite like, I like Mozart operas. I like Rossini, who's a kind of bel canto composer who, again, it's got kind of a silly and lighthearted air to him, which I really appreciate. And then more recently, my friend sent me a Sabrina Carpenter song called Please, Please, Please a while ago. And that's brilliant. And I've listened to a few more of Sabrina Carpenter's songs, and I'm a bit of a fan. I quite like it. They're kind of silly, they're lighthearted. And I also think that they kind of give voice to slightly more embarrassing and less wholesome feelings and emotions and sensations around romance that I think often get overlooked in a lot of modern art and not modern art, like modern romantic films and pop music and stuff. Like Please, Please, Please is fundamentally about having poor taste in your romantic partners and being aware of that, but being unable to change it. And a lot of Sabrina Carpenter's songs seem to be a bit like this, like Man-Child is very similar. One of the lyrics is why so sexy if so dumb? And I think that's kind of like, this, we've all, well, many of us have loved people that we wish we hadn't loved or didn't love, or were unreasonably attracted to people that we really oughtn't to have been unreasonably attracted to. And I think that's quite nice. And it's also done in a relatively kind way, I suppose. But I don't know, maybe I've only listened to a few of her tracks, so I couldn't make like a definitive statement of her oeuvre. But I quite like her. I quite like her so far. Apart from that, I really like the Canadian rock band Rush, which I think is much bigger than people think. Like, it's not a band that like loads of people have heard of, but it's sold like an extraordinary amount of albums. And they're a prog rock band, and a lot of them have written like really, really long songs that are kind of a mix between a rock song and a fable. And I quite like that. I think it's kind of creative and fun. And also, of course, I do like a bit of Elton John. And I was a kind of musical theatre kid at points in my life, so I quite like the old bit of musical theatre as well. Do I focus on lyrics a lot? Probably not. I've never got so into poetry either. I think I just need to learn more about it. And as a result, I just kind of I don't speak the same language as good lyricism, so I struggle to appreciate it, if that makes sense. Similar to how I don't know a lot about architecture, but I've got a friend, Sheehan, who's otherwise known as the cultural tutor, who's very, very lovely. He knows loads about architecture, and I walked through Durham with him one time, and he was just pointing at all the buildings and teaching me about them and telling me how they were made and what the different styles were. And it was like they became more beautiful as I learned to appreciate them through his knowledge. So if at some point I really kind of immerse myself in lyricism as an art form, I'm sure that I will come to appreciate song lyrics a lot more. In the same way that at one point I really didn't understand anything about music theory. But as I learned a bit more, I came to really appreciate the structure of compositions in a bit more depth and kind of learn to appreciate their beauty. So yeah, that's kind of the genre of music that I'm often into. What does your life look like outside the channel? Your hobbies, social life, and balancing it all? What are your goals or ideals for life in the future, near and far? Congratulations for the channel growth. Thank you so much. In terms of what my life looks like outside the channel does take up an extraordinary amount of time, but I do really like it. When I have tried to take days off in the past, quite a lot of the time what happens is I just end up reading philosophy, because I started the channel out of a pre-existing love for that, and the channel didn't even make any money at all for the first year or so, pretty much, and certainly didn't make enough for me to live on until a good year and a half in. Yes, I just find myself doing that. I still love it. I do a lot of maths as well. I kind of learn maths in my spare time, which I just think is, I think that it's good for the kind of health of your clarity of thought to do maths, but also it's just fun. Maths is beautiful, man. Apart from that, I go to the gym quite a lot. I'm not necessarily particularly strong or big. I just kind of enjoy it. It's really good stress relief. I have a tendency to get in my own head, get quite anxious, and it's very difficult to be anxious after you've done like 3 sets of heavy squats because you're just so exhausted. So I enjoy that. What are my goals or ideals for life in the future? Well, I'm really enjoying the channel, so I want to do that for sort of as long as I can. Though, as with any kind of social media success, right, it's fleeting. We all fall off at some point, and I'm quite careful to manage both my expectations and just my general life plans around the idea that, you know, at one point this channel will probably be pulling in 1/10 of the views that it's currently pulling in, and that will be a shame. And at that point, I will have to get another job. And I would really like to become a teacher. That's kind of my long-term plan anyway. I eventually want to become a secondary school teacher. Or I'll go back and try and do my PhD, but there's just so little funding for philosophy at the moment. I think that would be a pretty tall order. But I'd love to do a PhD at some point. So that would be some of my plans for the future. Hopefully going to write a book. Fingers crossed. I'm kind of working on a pitch for that at the moment. And yeah, in terms of like the near future for the channel, I'm going to do a full like 1.5 hour deep dive on Blood Meridian. I did a video last year on the character of the judge, but there's just so much more to say. And there's so much I didn't get to say then. And also I've been reading a lot more Cormac McCarthy, like other Cormac McCarthy recently. Like I read The Road recently, which was really good. And I'm reading No Country for Old Men, and it's just sort of I've just been really enjoying his work, so I kind of, that's got me hyped to make a video on it. I'm going to do a video on The Great Gatsby, just because I don't know, I feel like it's a book that people know, but I actually think that it's often better than people give it credit for in a lot of ways, and I think there are some kind of more existential themes there that could really be brought out. I want to do a video on the philosophy of the Marquis de Sade, which I'm actually like. I want to, because there just isn't that much online about him as a philosopher. At the same time, I hate reading the Marquis de Sade's work. I find it, I've got quite a squeamish disposition for violence, so it's not necessarily all that fun, but I will power through it. And there's actually surprisingly little secondary literature on the Marquis de Sade, so it will be a fun, slightly more speculative episode, I think. I want to do videos on snarkiness in online discourse. I've got kind of back into language, as you can probably tell from the video on pseudo-profound bullshit and the video on therapy talk. I've got really into language. I want to do a video on the philosophy of mental illness, probably following up on some of those Wakefield and Horowitz books that I mentioned in that video on therapy talk. They're fantastic and probably do deserve their own video. Yeah, in terms of, I don't know, I don't like to plan too far ahead. Life can be very uncertain. But that's kind of a rough idea of my goals and ideas for the future of the channel. I will probably post less frequently, is part of my plans. Part of that's because I'm starting these interviews and they take prep, but also, you know, they can break up the flow of recording and writing and stuff. And it's nice. It adds a tiny bit of variety. Yeah, I'm keen to keep the channel fresh, and partly to just keep my work fresh. Otherwise, I'm going to get, you know, bored eventually. And I don't want to get to the point where I'm bored and burnt out and asking, oh God, can I do, like, what am I going to do next? I want to just keep things fresh and evolving, and hopefully that will mean that I just won't feel burnt out. And you know, I know a lot of YouTubers now, because I've met lots, and quite a few have mentioned that you know, the importance of doing new things and finding new types of video and types of ways to approach videos and stuff like that, because otherwise it can become, even though it's still quite fun, it can become a little bit Sisyphean. I don't really feel that at all at the moment, so I'm quite keen to get ahead of that. And interviews, I think, will be part of that. Got some hopefully exciting interviews coming up. Interviewing Dr. Shane Littrell, who I referenced in my video on pseudo-profound bullshit. He's a researcher of bullshit and misinformation. I'm really looking forward to that. And I'm also hoping to, you know, Alex will come on the channel at some point, and that'll be really good fun. So I'm feeling very good about the channel and about work at the moment. One of the other comments was just, how are you? And I'm good. I'm actually feeling really good recently. I think that, I've moved flat recently and I feel very settled. I'm around friends and I'm around family. I try to spend all of the time that I'm not working on the channel and not reading and writing and stuff in company amongst, because, you know, my work's very solitary. It can get very lonely. Yeah, that's kind of what my hobby, social life, and balancing it all looks like. I'm sorry if that was kind of too much information. I try not to be too like parasocial on the channel because I don't 100% know. I don't know, like I don't want to give people like the wrong impression or anything like that. But yeah, that's a kind of insight into what my day-to-day life looks like. What is your favorite movie? Could be outside of philosophy. I don't know many films, but my favorite film is The Princess Bride. I mean, The Princess Bride's a pretty known film, so I don't think I have to explain it too much. But for those of you who haven't seen it, it's sort of a light-hearted fantasy adventure film that's also quite self-aware and semi-satirical. It's a bit like kind of live-action 80s Shrek. And it's fantastic. It's just so kind of, it's very charming. I'm a big fan of a whimsical, charming film, and The Princess Bride is definitely that. If you were to be given a chance to live as a certain person at a certain time or era, what person would you choose to be and why? Person would I choose to be? Oh God, I don't know. The thing is that quite a lot of people that I admire in history also weren't necessarily the happiest people in the world. Like, I really admire Wittgenstein, but Wittgenstein, by all accounts, was like a bit miserable. Maybe Russell. Russell's A, very clever and cool, and B, seemed to kind of quite enjoy life. You know, I get the sense that Russell genuinely had a good time going about his day-to-day existence. So maybe Russell, actually. Yeah, I think I'd probably go with Russell. And also, you know, 20th century, you get access to a fair bit of modern medicine, which is also very nice. I'm very pro kind of not dying of some kind of infected paper cut. What gives you hope? A great many things give me hope. Working on the channel gives me quite a lot of hope. You know, when I publish a video about something that I think is kind of a really niche topic and I don't expect anyone to be particularly interested in it, and then I find that there are people who enjoy that and want to read more about it and learn more about it, I think that's great. That never ceases to fill me with joy. And I publish quite a lot of my videos just fully expecting that no one will be interested, because quite a lot of the time they're about something quite specific or not necessarily, you know, most of my videos are just things that I'm interested in. And I kind of think, you know, hopefully other people find this interesting, and that's great if they do. And people do, and that's amazing. I kind of live my life immersed in constant barrages of hope coming at me from all directions. So it's very difficult for me not to have hope. And I recognize that is partly just because I'm very lucky. Do you think you could take Aristotle in a cage match? Well, I definitely couldn't take Plato in a cage match because he was a professional wrestler. And I'm pretty certain I could take very, very few people in a cage match. So I think Aristotle would almost certainly wipe the floor with me. Also, you know, whenever you see paintings or statues of, you know, people have tried to render Aristotle, admittedly hundreds of years after his death, he always looks quite strong and sinewy. So no, I think he would absolutely wipe the floor with me. What is your greatest aspiration in life? God, it's quite a deep one. I have a lot of aspirations. I would like to write a book at some point. I would hopefully like to get a PhD at some point. That would be really nice. I want to try and learn as much as I can. My greatest aspiration, though, is probably to have a family. I've always wanted a family, and I've always wanted the opportunity to read to my child as they fall asleep. So that's probably my greatest aspiration, although that is cheesy and cringe. It is also, unfortunately, true. I've been thinking about how philosophy fits into platforms like YouTube. In your experience, what are some of the opportunities and challenges that come with exploring philosophical ideas on this platform? So yeah, there are lots of opportunities and lots of challenges. One of the main challenges is that when you are on a screen talking to people, it's very easy for them to imbue you with a sense of authority that you haven't necessarily earned, right? Like, I'm always very clear that I don't want people watching my videos to think that I am infallible, or that my interpretations are gospel, or that I'm necessarily even right about things, you know? So that's one challenge. And I get around that by just saying at the beginning of each video, look, this is going to be simplifying some things, and don't take my word as truth. This is like I hope for my videos to kind of just be an aid for other people doing their own thinking, rather than as a kind of a lecture for people to imbibe. I would hate for people to think that they necessarily have to agree with me on anything. In fact, I think that quite a lot of advance in one's own thinking is taken by disagreement rather than necessarily agreement. There are, however, lots of opportunities when it comes to doing any kind of educational thing on YouTube. I think one of them is that people don't have to pay to watch them, which is great, right? Like you can, I did a video on Emile Cioran a while ago, and Emile Cioran is, a pretty well-read philosopher in the French Francosphere, but not necessarily as much in the Anglosphere. A lot of people have heard of him, but I don't know many people who have read him amongst people that I know in person. I have a circle that is understandably pretty heavily weighted towards people who are really into philosophy. So it's wonderful to be able to blast out some Cioran to the world and just say, look, go and read this guy. He's awesome. So that would be, that's one of the wonderful opportunities. You get to reach lots of people, and people don't have to, pay tuition fees to you. They can just enjoy. And hopefully, the idea is that they take that, they use that either as a starting point or as a kind of step on their own learning journey. God, that's such a wanky expression. But you know what I mean? Like they use that as part of their process. And that's my fondest hope. My fondest hope is that after watching one of my videos, hopefully somebody feels compelled or encouraged to pick up one of the books that I've talked about for themselves and read them and think about them. That's very exciting. And I don't know, I hope that that's roughly the effect of my videos. Though, of course, I've got no way of knowing. What's your biggest pet peeve when it comes to philosophical debates? I think it's condescension. When people are condescending towards others, it really does get under my skin, because I always think, look, the thing about being human is that we all know so little. For almost all of us, there are going to be innumerable people that know more than us about any given topic, right? Even if we devoted our lives to the study of one particular thing, there would probably still be somebody who knew more than us about that thing, simply by virtue of being older than us and having looked at it for longer. But there would certainly be lots of people that knew more about related things or just other things, right? I think one of my general pet peeve, philosophically and generally, is when people think that because they've read a bit or because they know a bit, or even because they've read or know a lot, that gives them the right to assume that other people are stupid and that to kind of talk down to them or condescend to them. I think the reason that gets under my skin so much as well is because it is a fundamentally anti-curious stance to take. And I think that curiosity is such a brilliant thing that I would hope, I think that if we could get a bit more earnest curiosity in the world, I don't think that could do any harm. And I think that kind of snark or condescension really does kind of rob people of the ability to be innocently curious. Because if they're innocently curious and they don't know something or they get something wrong, which we all inevitably do, there's a fear around that now. And I think that's a real shame. I think that it's that would be my ultimate pet peeve when it comes to philosophical debates. And I think, unfortunately, it does happen a fair amount. And I think that is a real shame. I think it's something that we could all potentially learn to be a bit better at. Right, that's all we've got time for today. Thank you so much for watching, and if I haven't answered your question, I'm very sorry. If you want to check out another of my casual videos, you can see me stumble through the philosophical paradoxes iceberg right here. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.